I never thought a simple ring hidden in my mother's jewelry box would destroy my family's perception of me forever. But when your own sister calls your most precious inheritance worthless junk at the family estate meeting, and then a royal jeweler walks into that same room 3 days later to reveal it's a lost crown jewel worth $50 million, everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and worth gets turned completely upside down. That moment came during what was supposed to be a quiet division of our mother's belongings when Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield from the Royal Heritage Foundation knocked on our door and uttered the words that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Matthews, and according to my family, I was the daughter who never quite measured up. The one who chose art school over business school, who worked at a small gallery instead of climbing corporate ladders, who lived in a modest apartment in Riverside District, while my sister Jessica built her empire in Willowbrook Estates. For the past year since our mother Margaret's passing, I had quietly accepted their assessment that I was the impractical dreamer, the one who needed guidance and gentle correction at every family gathering. What they didn't know was that the simple silver ring I wore every day on my right hand, the one they dismissed as cheap costume jewelry from my mother's collection of worthless trinkets, was about to reveal a truth so extraordinary that it would rewrite not just our family's financial situation but every assumption they had ever made about value, worth, and who deserved respect in our household. The ring itself was unremarkable to most eyes. A delicate silver band with what appeared to be a small cloudy stone that caught the light in odd ways. The metal showed signs of age, with tiny scratches and a patina that spoke of decades of wear. My mother had worn it occasionally, usually hidden beneath other jewelry or tucked away altogether. She had never spoken much about its origins, only mentioning once that it had belonged to her grandmother back in Vermont, passed down through women who had little else to leave their daughters. When I was 16 and fascinated by anything vintage or antique, I had asked my mother about the ring's history. She had smiled in that distant way she sometimes got when talking about her childhood and said it was just an old family piece, probably worth more in sentiment than actual value. She had let me wear it to my high school graduation, and I had felt connected to generations of women I had never met, imagining the hands that had worn this simple band before mine. After her funeral last October, when we had gathered to sort through her belongings, the ring had been sitting in a small velvet box among her other jewelry. Jessica had picked it up, examined it with the critical eye she applied to everything, and declared it obviously costume jewelry, probably worth less than $20 at most. She had suggested we donate the entire box to charity rather than waste time having anything appraised, but I had quietly asked if I could keep just this one piece. The request had been met with the kind of indulgent sympathy my family specialized in. Of course I could keep the worthless ring. Of course I would want to cling to sentimental trinkets while Jessica focused on the practical matters of estate division. Of course I would choose emotional attachment over financial sense. It fit perfectly with their narrative of who I was and how I approached life. So I had slipped the ring onto my finger that day and had worn it every day since, feeling close to my mother and to the mysterious women who had worn it before her. It became my daily connection to a history I knew little about, a tangible link to the past that felt more valuable than any amount of money could represent. Jessica Matthews Norton had always been everything our parents admired in a daughter. At 34, 2 years older than me, she was the embodiment of success by every conventional measure. She had graduated summa cum laude from business school, worked her way up to vice president at Cromwell Financial Services, and married Michael Norton, a successful attorney who specialized in corporate law. They lived in a sprawling colonial house in Willowbrook Estates, drove matching luxury cars, and belonged to the Millbrook Country Club, where they networked with other ambitious couples who measured worth in square footage and investment portfolios. Jessica had inherited our mother's sharp intellect and our father's drive for achievement, but she had also developed a particular talent for making others feel small through seemingly caring observations. She never directly insulted anyone. Instead, she would express concern about my choices, offer helpful suggestions for improving my situation, and speak about my life with the kind of gentle disappointment usually reserved for discussing chronic illnesses or unfortunate accidents. My apartment in Riverside District was described as charming but impractical. My job at Whitmore Gallery was interesting but not financially stable. My choice to pursue art history instead of business was creative but unrealistic. Every aspect of my life was qualified with a but that transformed what could have been compliments into subtle criticisms wrapped in sisterly concern. Michael Norton perfectly complemented Jessica's approach to family dynamics. He was the kind of man who listened carefully to conversations, asked thoughtful questions about your life, and then offered advice based on his extensive experience with people who had made better choices. He spoke to me the way successful men speak to women they consider pleasant but fundamentally unserious, with a combination of charm and condescension that made me feel both welcomed and dismissed simultaneously. Our father David had never quite recovered from losing our mother. At 62, he seemed older than his years, moving through his retirement from Millbrook manufacturing with the careful deliberation of someone who had lost his anchor. He relied heavily on Jessica for guidance about financial matters and family decisions, treating her opinions with the deference usually reserved for professional advisors. When Jessica spoke about family matters, Dad listened with the attention of someone who had already decided that her judgment was superior to his own. His relationship with me was
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
loving but tinged with worry. He saw me as the daughter who needed protection and guidance, who made choices based on emotion rather than logic, who would benefit from Jessica's practical wisdom if only I would listen more carefully. He never said these things directly, but they lived in the spaces between his words, in the way he would glance at Jessica for confirmation when I spoke about my work or my plans. Linda Matthews, who had married our father 3 years after our mother's death, brought her own perspective to our family dynamics. She was a kind woman who tried hard to find her place in a family still shaped by grief and established patterns. Linda worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital and approached family relationships with the same gentle competence she brought to patient care. She genuinely wanted everyone to get along and often found herself in the position of smoothing over tensions that the rest of us had learned to navigate around rather than address directly. Linda's presence had initially created some awkwardness, particularly for Jessica, who seemed to view any changes to family traditions as potential threats to the memory of our mother. But Linda had been patient and respectful, never trying to replace anyone or change too much too quickly. She had won over Jessica through consistent demonstration of her commitment to Dad's happiness and her respect for our family's established ways of doing things. The extended family that surrounded us in Millbrook consisted of people who had known us since childhood and had their own firm opinions about the Matthews sisters and how we had turned out. Uncle Thomas, Dad's younger brother, worked in construction and had strong opinions about the value of practical skills versus theoretical knowledge. He had always been proud of Jessica's business success and gently mystified by my choice to work in an art gallery, though he was too polite to say so directly. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Thomas's wife, had worked as a secretary at the high school for 20 years and considered herself an expert on how young people should prepare for successful futures. She often shared stories about former students who had made excellent career choices and were now thriving in stable, well-paying jobs. These stories were never directly compared to my situation, but the implications were clear enough to everyone listening. Our cousin Ashley, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Patricia's daughter, had followed a path similar to Jessica's, earning her nursing degree and marrying a local police officer. She owned a tidy house in the established part of town and had 2 children who were excelling in school and sports. Ashley represented the kind of solid practical success that our family understood and celebrated, the antithesis of my more uncertain artistic pursuits. The family friends who had remained close to us after our mother's death included Dorothy Wilson, who had worked alongside our mother at the Millbrook Public Library for 15 years. Dorothy was a widow in her 70s who had become something of a surrogate aunt to Jessica and me, offering advice and support during the difficult months after our mother's funeral. She had strong opinions about the importance of financial security and often worried aloud about young people who chose careers based on passion rather than practical considerations. Helen Rodriguez lived next door to our childhood home and had been our mother's closest friend for over 20 years. She had watched Jessica and me grow up and had her own theories about our different personalities and the choices we had made as adults. Helen worked as a bookkeeper for several local businesses and had developed a sharp eye for financial stability and the kind of planning that led to secure futures. All of these people formed the constellation of relationships that shaped how I understood myself and my place in the world. They were good people who cared about me genuinely, but they shared a common perspective on success and worth that left little room for alternative definitions of a life well lived. In their view, Jessica had made smart choices that led to obvious rewards, while I had chosen a more difficult path that was unlikely to provide the same level of security and social recognition. The funeral last October had been held at St. Mary's Church on a gray morning that seemed to match the mood of everyone who gathered to say goodbye to Margaret Matthews. Our mother had been beloved in the community, known for her volunteer work at the library and her gentle way of helping neighbors through difficult times. The church had been full of people whose lives she had touched in small but meaningful ways, and the stories shared that day painted a picture of a woman who had found wealth in relationships and satisfaction in service to others. During the reception following the service, I had noticed how naturally people gravitated toward Jessica when they wanted to express condolences or offer help with practical matters. She had handled the logistics of the funeral with impressive efficiency, coordinating with the church, the funeral home, and the caterers with the same organizational skills she brought to her professional responsibilities. People trusted her to make good decisions and handle complex situations, and she had risen to the occasion with grace and competence. I had found myself in the role of the emotional daughter, accepting hugs and sympathy, while Jessica managed the details that needed attention. It wasn't that I was incapable of handling practical matters, but rather that people naturally assumed Jessica would take charge of anything requiring decision-making or coordination. I had been grateful for her efficiency during those difficult days, but I had also felt somewhat invisible in the process, as if my grief was the only contribution expected from me. The weeks following the funeral had established patterns that continued throughout the year. Jessica had taken charge of managing our mother's financial affairs, working with Dad to close accounts, transfer assets, and handle the various administrative tasks that death requires. I had focused on preserving our mother's personal belongings, carefully sorting through photo albums, letters, and the small treasures that had filled her daily life. When Jessica had suggested we wait a full year before dividing our mother's personal possessions, it had seemed like a thoughtful way to honor our grief and avoid making emotional decisions during the most difficult period. But as the anniversary of our mother's death approached, I began to realize that the delay had also meant that Jessica had essentially become the executor of decisions about what had value and what should be discarded. The jewelry box that contained the ring had been sitting in our mother's bedroom dresser for the entire year, untouched except for my single request to keep the simple silver band. Jessica had made it clear that she considered most of our mother's jewelry to be outdated costume pieces with more sentimental than monetary value. She had suggested that we might find a few pieces worth keeping as mementos, but that the majority should probably be donated to charity rather than taking up space in our own homes. This perspective had felt harsh to me, but I had lacked the expertise to argue with her assessment. Jessica had always been better at determining the practical value of things, while I tended to attach emotional significance to objects that others might consider worthless. Her certainty about the jewelry's lack of value had fit so perfectly with our established family roles that I had accepted her judgment despite my own instincts. The ring I wore daily had become a kind of talisman during the year of grief that followed our mother's death. When I missed her voice, or wished I could ask her advice about something, I would touch the ring and feel connected to her memory. When work was particularly challenging, or I felt overwhelmed by the subtle criticisms that seemed to follow me through family gatherings, the ring reminded me that I was part of something larger than my current circumstances. I had begun to research its possible origins during quiet moments at the gallery, spending lunch breaks exploring online databases of antique jewelry and historical records from Vermont. The more I learned about jewelry from different periods and regions, the more convinced I became that the ring was older and possibly more significant than it appeared. The craftsmanship was subtle but sophisticated, and the stone, while cloudy and unremarkable at first glance, had qualities that seemed inconsistent with costume jewelry. But every time I had mentioned these observations to family members, they had been met with the kind of gentle dismissal I had come to expect. Jessica had reminded me that wishful thinking often led people to imagine value where none existed. Dad had suggested that my interest in art history might be causing me to see significance where there was only sentiment. Even Linda had gently observed that people often discovered what they hoped to find when they looked closely enough at inherited objects. Their reactions had taught me to keep my growing suspicions to myself. I had continued wearing the ring and quietly researching its possible origins, but I had stopped sharing my theories with people who had already decided that my tendency to romanticize things made me an unreliable judge of practical value. The ring had become my private project, a mystery I was solving alone while maintaining the fiction that I accepted their assessment of its worthlessness. As the first anniversary of our mother's death approached, Jessica had scheduled a family meeting to finally divide the remaining personal belongings and close this chapter of our shared grief. The meeting was planned for a Saturday afternoon at our childhood home on Elm Street, where Dad and Linda now lived, surrounded by the furniture and photographs that had defined our family's daily life for decades. I had approached the meeting with mixed feelings, knowing that it would force difficult decisions about which pieces of our mother's life we would preserve and which we would let go. But I had also felt a quiet anticipation, wondering if the time had finally come to share what I had learned about the ring, and to suggest that perhaps our mother's jewelry deserved more careful evaluation than Jessica's quick assessment had provided. What I hadn't anticipated was that the meeting would become the setting for a revelation so extraordinary that it would challenge everything our family thought they knew about value, worth, and the wisdom of snap judgments based on appearances. Part 2: Character Introduction and False Perception. The Saturday afternoon meeting took place in our family's living room on Elm Street, the same space where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones throughout our childhood. The familiar furniture and family photographs created an atmosphere of continuity, but there was an underlying tension that came with the knowledge that we were about to dismantle pieces of our mother's legacy. Jessica had arrived 30 minutes early, as was her habit for any gathering that required organization or decision-making. She had brought labeled boxes, tissue paper for wrapping delicate items, and a notebook where she planned to record our decisions about each piece. Michael had come with her, carrying his briefcase despite this being a family matter rather than a legal proceeding. He had explained that he wanted to be available in case any questions arose about proper procedures for transferring ownership of inherited items. His presence added a layer of formality to what might otherwise have been an intimate family moment, but Jessica clearly appreciated having someone there who understood the importance of handling these matters correctly. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Patricia had driven over from their house across town, bringing Ashley with them for what Patricia described as a learning experience about how families handle difficult transitions. They had settled into the kitchen with Dad and Linda, drinking coffee and sharing memories about Margaret while we prepared for the more challenging task of dividing her belongings. Dorothy Wilson had been invited because of her close friendship with our mother and her practical knowledge about the value of household items accumulated over decades of helping elderly friends downsize their possessions. She had positioned herself near the boxes of jewelry and accessories, ready to offer guidance about what might be worth keeping versus what should be donated to families who could use everyday items. Helen Rodriguez had brought her expertise as someone who had helped several neighbors handle estate matters over the years. She understood which local charities welcomed different types of donations, and which items might have enough value to warrant professional appraisal. Her presence provided additional support for the practical decisions we would need to make about our mother's accumulated possessions. As I walked into this gathering, wearing my usual weekend outfit of jeans and a simple sweater, I could feel the familiar dynamic settling into place around me. Jessica was already discussing organizational strategies with Michael, her voice carrying the confident tone she used when managing complex projects. The others were looking to her for guidance about how to proceed, naturally deferring to her expertise in handling complicated situations. I had worn the ring, as I did every day, but I had also brought along a small folder containing the research I had been conducting over the past several months. Inside were printouts of historical jewelry catalogs, photographs of similar pieces I had found in museum collections, and notes about the craftsmanship techniques that seemed to match what I observed in my mother's ring. I wasn't sure whether I would have the courage to share this information, but I wanted to be prepared in case the opportunity arose. The jewelry box that had been sitting undisturbed in our mother's bedroom dresser was brought downstairs and placed on the coffee table where everyone could examine its contents. Jessica immediately took charge of the process, opening the box and beginning to sort the pieces into categories based on their apparent value and condition. She handled each item with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory, describing what she saw, and asking for input about whether anyone had particular attachment to specific pieces. Most of our mother's jewelry collection consisted of pieces that were clearly contemporary and of modest value. There were earrings from department stores, necklaces that had been gifts from Dad over the years, and bracelets that Margaret had purchased for herself during shopping trips with friends. These items told the story of a woman who had appreciated beautiful things without needing them to be expensive or particularly significant beyond their personal meaning to her. Jessica's assessment of each piece was thorough and practical. She identified items that might have some resale value, pieces that were too worn or damaged to be worth keeping, and a few that had enough sentimental significance to warrant preservation as family mementos. Her approach was systematic and logical, taking into account both the financial and emotional factors that should influence our decisions. When she reached the simple silver ring that I had been wearing for the past year, Jessica held it up for everyone to see and shook her head with the kind of bemused affection she might show for a child's treasured rock collection. She explained that this was the piece I had chosen to keep from our mother's collection, and while she understood my sentimental attachment to it, she wanted everyone to understand that it was essentially worthless from any practical standpoint. The ring, she explained, showed clear signs of being costume jewelry manufactured sometime in the mid-20th century. The silver was obviously plated rather than solid, as evidenced by the wear patterns around the band. The stone was some kind of glass or synthetic material, designed to imitate a more valuable gem, but the cloudy appearance and lack of brilliance made it clear that it had no actual monetary worth. Jessica's analysis was delivered with the same tone she might use to explain a complex financial concept to a client who lacked expertise in investment strategy. She wasn't being cruel or dismissive, but rather helpful in ensuring that everyone understood the reality of what we were dealing with. In her view, it was important for me to have realistic expectations about the piece I had chosen to keep, rather than harboring romantic notions about hidden value that simply didn't exist. Michael nodded approvingly as Jessica explained her assessment, adding his own observations about the importance of getting professional appraisals for any items that might have significant value. He mentioned that his law firm regularly worked with estate situations where family members had unrealistic expectations about inherited items, leading to disappointment and conflict when professional evaluations revealed the truth about what things were actually worth. The conversation continued with various family members sharing their own experiences with inherited jewelry and the lessons they had learned about distinguishing between sentimental and monetary value. Dorothy Wilson mentioned helping a friend who had been convinced that her grandmother's brooch was a valuable antique, only to discover that it was a well-made reproduction worth less than $50. Helen Rodriguez shared a similar story about a neighbor who had spent money on an appraisal for a ring that turned out to be worth less than the cost of the evaluation. These stories were shared with kindness, meant to help me understand that my attachment to the ring was perfectly natural and appropriate, while also ensuring that I didn't develop unrealistic expectations about its financial significance. The message was clear: sentimental value was important and valid, but it was crucial not to confuse emotional attachment with actual worth in any practical sense. Uncle Thomas offered his perspective as someone who had worked with his hands for decades and had developed an eye for distinguishing between quality craftsmanship and mass-produced items. He examined the ring briefly and confirmed Jessica's assessment, noting that the construction techniques and materials were consistent with inexpensive jewelry made for everyday wear rather than precious pieces meant to last for generations. Aunt Patricia added her own observations about the importance of managing expectations when dealing with inherited items, particularly for young people who might not have experience evaluating the difference between items that looked old or interesting and items that actually had historical or monetary significance. She suggested that learning to make these distinctions was an important part of developing practical life skills. Ashley, who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, mentioned that she had recently helped a coworker sort through her deceased grandmother's belongings, and had been surprised by how many items that looked valuable turned out to be essentially worthless. The experience had taught her the importance of getting professional opinions rather than relying on assumptions based on appearance or family stories about significance. As the discussion continued, I found myself feeling smaller and more foolish with each additional comment about the importance of realistic expectations and practical thinking. The research folder I had brought remained unopened in my purse, and I began to question whether the information I had gathered was as significant as I had believed. Perhaps I had been seeing patterns that didn't exist, imagining connections that were based more on wishful thinking than actual evidence. The ring on my finger suddenly felt different, less like a connection to family history, and more like evidence of my tendency to romanticize things that were ultimately ordinary. I touched it unconsciously while listening to the conversation, wondering whether I should share my research or simply accept the consensus that my instincts about its possible significance were misguided. Dad had been watching the discussion with the careful attention he brought to any conversation where Jessica was sharing her expertise. He clearly valued her judgment and trusted her ability to handle these kinds of practical decisions. When he looked at me, his expression was gentle but concerned, as if he worried that I might be setting myself up for disappointment by investing too much emotional energy in objects that couldn't possibly live up to my expectations. Linda had been taking notes about which items each person wanted to keep and which should be donated to various charitable organizations. She approached the task with the same organized compassion she brought to her nursing work, ensuring that everyone's feelings were considered while also maintaining focus on the practical
decisions that needed to be made. When the conversation turned to my ring, she offered reassurance that keeping pieces with sentimental value was important regardless of their monetary worth. The overall atmosphere in the room was one of gentle but firm reality checking, with everyone working together to ensure that our family's final decisions about our mother's belongings were based on accurate information rather than romantic fantasies. The message being communicated, both directly and indirectly, was that while my emotional attachment to the ring was understandable and appropriate, it would be harmful for me to develop unrealistic expectations about its significance beyond its personal meaning to me. Part 3. The hidden truth revealed to audience. What none of them knew, what I had been discovering through months of careful research during my lunch breaks at Whitmore Gallery, was that the ring they so confidently dismissed as worthless costume jewelry showed characteristics that were far more intriguing than its modest appearance suggested. The cloudy stone that Jessica had identified as obviously synthetic glass actually exhibited optical properties that I had learned to associate with much more rare and valuable materials. The supposedly cheap silver setting showed construction techniques that predated mass production methods by several decades. My work at the gallery had given me access to resources that most people never encountered in their daily lives. Margaret Steinberg, the curator of our historical jewelry collection, had become something of a mentor to me over the past 3 years. She had taught me to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating pieces that came through our authentication process, and she had shared techniques for identifying markers of age, provenance, and craftsmanship that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. During my research, I had discovered that the setting techniques visible in my mother's ring were consistent with European court jewelry from the early 19th century. The way the stone was secured, the particular style of the band's construction, and even the wear pattern suggested that this piece had been created by someone with access to both high-quality materials and sophisticated craftsmanship techniques that were typically reserved for commissions from wealthy or aristocratic clients. The stone itself had been the subject of my most intensive investigation. What appeared to be a cloudy, unremarkable gem actually showed signs of being what gemologists call a rose-cut diamond that had been deliberately treated to reduce its brilliance. This technique had been used historically to disguise valuable stones during periods of political instability, allowing owners to wear their wealth without attracting attention from those who might seek to confiscate obvious displays of valuable jewelry. Rose-cut diamonds from the early 19th century often appeared cloudy or dull to modern eyes because the cutting technique was designed to maximize the stone's size rather than its sparkle. These diamonds were typically cut with 24 triangular facets that created a dome-like appearance, quite different from the brilliant cuts that became popular in later periods. The technique had fallen out of favor by the mid-1800s, which meant that any piece featuring this type of stone was likely to be significantly older than its appearance might suggest. Through my research at the gallery, I had also learned about the practice of incognito jewelry that had been popular among European nobility during periods of revolution and political upheaval. Valuable pieces were deliberately designed to look modest or even shabby, allowing their owners to maintain their wealth while avoiding the dangerous attention that obvious displays of luxury might attract. These pieces often ended up scattered across the world as families fled political persecution, sometimes ending up in the possession of people who had no idea of their true significance. The more I had learned about these historical practices, the more convinced I had become that my mother's ring exhibited several characteristics consistent with disguised court jewelry from the early 1800s. The construction techniques, the stone cutting, even the particular alloy used in the setting all pointed toward a piece that had been created for someone with access to the highest levels of craftsmanship available during that period. My research had led me to historical records about jewelry that had disappeared from various European courts during the Napoleonic period and its aftermath. Political instability had caused many aristocratic families to flee their homelands, often carrying only what jewelry they could conceal or disguise as worthless trinkets. Many of these pieces had never been recovered, and their current whereabouts remained unknown to historians and art recovery specialists. One particular case had captured my attention during my research. In 1814, during the final collapse of Napoleon's empire, several pieces of jewelry belonging to the French court had disappeared from the palace archives. These pieces had been catalogued extensively before their disappearance, including detailed descriptions of their construction, materials, and distinctive characteristics. The records indicated that at least 3 rings had been among the missing items, all featuring rose-cut diamonds set in silver bands using specific techniques that were characteristic of court jewelers from that period. The descriptions in these historical records had matched several key features of my mother's ring with an accuracy that seemed too specific to be coincidental. The size and setting of the stone, the particular construction of the band, even the way the silver had been worked to create specific decorative elements all aligned with the documented characteristics of one of the missing pieces from the French court collection. But the most compelling piece of evidence I had discovered was hidden inside the band itself. Using the gallery's magnification equipment during a particularly quiet afternoon, I had found tiny markings that were invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible under proper lighting and magnification. These markings appeared to be maker's marks or possibly coded identifiers that had been used by court jewelers to authenticate their work and track pieces within royal collections. The symbols I had found matched examples I had seen in historical documents about jewelry authentication from the early 19th century. They appeared to follow the coding system that had been used by specific workshops that created pieces for the French court during the period immediately before and after Napoleon's reign. The presence of these markings suggested that the ring had not only been created by court jewelers, but that it had been significant enough to warrant the kind of careful documentation that was typically reserved for the most valuable pieces in royal collections. All of this research had been conducted quietly during my own time, using resources at the gallery that I had access to through my regular work responsibilities. I had been careful not to make my investigation obvious to my colleagues, partly because I wasn't sure whether my theories would prove correct, and partly because I was still processing the implications of what I was discovering. If my research was accurate, the ring that my family had dismissed as worthless costume jewelry was actually a piece of French court jewelry that had been missing from historical records for over 200 years. The value of such a piece would be extraordinary not just because of its materials, but because of its historical significance and the rarity of authenticated court jewelry from that specific period. The challenge I faced was that proving the ring's authenticity and provenance would require the kind of extensive documentation and expert authentication that was far beyond my capabilities as a gallery employee with access to basic research resources. The definitive identification of court jewelry required specialists who had spent decades studying the specific techniques, materials, and documentation associated with pieces from particular periods and locations. I had been wrestling with whether to share my discoveries with my family, knowing that they would likely be skeptical of research that contradicted their confident assessment of the ring's worthlessness. Their reaction to my interest in the ring's possible significance had already made it clear that they viewed my theories as examples of wishful thinking rather than serious investigation. But as I sat in that living room, listening to their continued discussion about the importance of realistic expectations and practical thinking, I found myself becoming more certain that the time had come to present what I had learned. The evidence I had gathered was substantial enough to warrant professional evaluation, regardless of whether my family believed my initial assessment was credible. The folder in my purse contained copies of the historical records I had found, photographs of the markings inside the ring's band, and detailed comparisons between the ring's characteristics and the documented features of missing court jewelry from the period I believed it represented. This information deserved to be evaluated by experts who could either confirm or refute my theories based on professional analysis, rather than assumptions about my tendency to romanticize inherited objects. What I didn't yet know was that within 72 hours, my months of careful research would be validated in a way that would shock not just my family, but experts in historical jewelry authentication who had been searching for this particular piece for decades. The ring they had dismissed so confidently was about to be revealed as one of the most significant examples of missing court jewelry ever recovered, with a provenance and value that would transform not just our understanding of its worth, but our entire family's financial situation. Part 4, the contrast character setup. Jessica Matthews Norton represented everything that our community understood and celebrated about success in the modern world. At 34, she had built a career that commanded respect from colleagues, clients, and family members, who recognized her ability to navigate complex financial situations with skill and confidence. Her office at Cromwell Financial Services occupied a corner of the building's executive floor, with windows that overlooked Millbrook's historic downtown district and furniture that reflected both her professional status and her personal taste for understated elegance. Her typical workday began at 7 in the morning with a review of market reports and client portfolios, followed by meetings with individuals and families who trusted her expertise to guide their investment decisions and financial planning strategies. Jessica's clients included some of Millbrook's most successful professionals, business owners who had built companies from small startups into significant enterprises, and retirees who had accumulated substantial assets through decades of careful planning and smart decision-making. The respect Jessica commanded in professional settings extended naturally into her personal relationships and family dynamics. When friends faced difficult financial decisions, they called Jessica for advice. When neighbors needed recommendations for attorneys, accountants, or investment advisors, they knew that Jessica's suggestions would be reliable and well-researched. When our extended family gathered for holidays or special occasions, conversations about money, investments, and financial planning naturally gravitated toward Jessica's expertise. Her marriage to Michael Norton had created a partnership that amplified both of their professional capabilities and social influence. Michael's legal practice focused on corporate law and estate planning, which meant that he and Jessica often worked with overlapping networks of clients and professional contacts. Together, they represented the kind of power couple that other ambitious professionals admired and sought to emulate, successful individuals who had found partners who enhanced rather than limited their career trajectories. Their home in Willowbrook Estates reflected both their financial success and their understanding of how material possessions communicate status and values to the broader community. The house itself was a colonial revival design that balanced traditional architectural elements with modern amenities, creating an atmosphere that felt both established and contemporary. The furnishings had been selected to create an environment that was comfortable for entertaining clients and colleagues, while also providing a peaceful retreat from the demands of their professional responsibilities. Jessica's approach to family relationships followed the same principles that guided her professional interactions. She believed in the importance of honest communication, practical planning, and making decisions based on careful analysis rather than emotional impulses. When family members faced challenges or needed guidance, Jessica offered the same systematic approach to problem solving that had made her successful in business, analyzing situations objectively and providing recommendations based on proven strategies for achieving positive outcomes. Her assessment of my life choices and circumstances reflected this systematic approach to evaluating situations and identifying areas where improvements could be made. From Jessica's perspective, my decision to work at an art gallery represented a choice to prioritize personal satisfaction over financial security, which was understandable but ultimately problematic for long-term stability and independence. My preference for living in Riverside District rather than investing in property in a more desirable neighborhood reflected a failure to understand how strategic decisions about housing could build wealth over time. Jessica's concerns about my lifestyle weren't motivated by cruelty or competition, but rather by genuine worry about my future security and independence. In her view, I was making choices that felt satisfying in the short term but would likely create difficulties as I aged and needed to provide for myself without the support systems that come with traditional career advancement and accumulation of assets. When Jessica looked at my situation, she saw someone who was drifting through life without the kind of strategic planning that was necessary for building long-term security and independence. My work at the gallery might be personally fulfilling, but it didn't provide the kind of salary or benefits that would allow me to accumulate significant savings or investments. My apartment in Riverside District might suit my current needs, but renting rather than owning meant that I was building equity for someone else, rather than creating wealth for myself. The contrast between Jessica's life and mine was particularly stark when it came to our different approaches to inherited family property and possessions. Jessica understood the importance of evaluating inherited items objectively, distinguishing between pieces that had genuine value and those that were worth keeping only for sentimental reasons. Her systematic approach to handling our mother's estate reflected the same careful analysis she brought to managing investment portfolios and financial planning for clients who trusted her to maximize the value of their assets. Michael's presence in these family discussions added additional weight to Jessica's assessments and recommendations. His legal training provided expertise about proper procedures for handling inherited property, while his experience with estate planning gave him insight into the kinds of decisions that families should make to avoid future complications or disappointments. When Michael agreed with Jessica's evaluation of a situation, it carried the authority of professional expertise that other family members found difficult to question or contradict. Together, Jessica and Michael represented a level of professional competence and social status that commanded automatic respect from the other adults in our family circle. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Patricia looked to them for guidance about financial matters and major decisions, treating their opinions with the deference typically reserved for expert advisors. Dad relied on Jessica's judgment about complex situations, particularly those involving money or legal considerations that he felt unprepared to handle on his own. Their success had been built through a combination of education, hard work, and strategic decision-making that aligned with conventional wisdom about how to build wealth and achieve social recognition. Jessica had chosen a college major that led directly to employment opportunities in a growing field. She had worked consistently to build professional relationships and develop expertise that made her valuable to employers and clients. She had married someone whose career complemented her own ambitions and whose family background provided additional social and professional connections. Every major decision Jessica and Michael had made together reflected careful consideration of long-term consequences and strategic advantages. Their choice of neighborhood positioned them among other successful professionals who could provide networking opportunities and social connections. Their involvement in community organizations and charitable activities created visibility and reputation that enhanced their professional standing. Their financial planning and investment strategies were designed to build wealth systematically while also providing security against unexpected challenges or opportunities. From Jessica's perspective, success was largely a matter of making smart choices consistently over time, avoiding unnecessary risks, and building on proven strategies for career advancement and wealth accumulation. The challenges and disappointments that people experienced were usually the result of poor planning, unrealistic expectations, or failure to seek appropriate professional guidance when making important decisions. This worldview made it difficult for Jessica to understand or validate choices that prioritized personal fulfillment over financial security, or that involved taking risks based on intuition rather than careful analysis. My decision to work in the art world, my preference for living in a diverse neighborhood rather than an exclusive one, and my tendency to find value in objects or experiences that didn't have obvious monetary worth all seemed like examples of impractical thinking that would ultimately create problems. Jessica's assessment of our mother's jewelry collection, and particularly her confident dismissal of the ring I had chosen to keep, reflected this systematic approach to evaluating inherited property. She had examined each piece carefully, considering its materials, construction, and probable market value before making recommendations about what should be kept versus what should be donated or discarded. Her conclusion that my ring was worthless, costume jewelry was based on the same analytical approach that she used to evaluate investment opportunities for her clients. The certainty with which Jessica expressed her opinions about the ring's lack of value reflected not arrogance, but rather confidence in her ability to distinguish between items that had genuine worth and those that only appeared valuable to people who lacked expertise in making such assessments. In her experience, people often convinced themselves that inherited objects were more significant than they actually were, either because they wanted to believe they had received something valuable, or because they confused sentimental attachment with actual monetary worth. Jessica's success had been built on her ability to see through emotional attachments and wishful thinking to identify the practical realities of situations. This skill had made her excellent at helping clients make smart financial decisions, but it also meant that she approached family situations with the same skeptical analysis that she applied to investment opportunities or business propositions. When I expressed interest in researching the ring's possible significance, Jessica interpreted this as another example of my tendency to avoid facing practical realities about my situation. Part 5: Pattern of Dismissal and Underestimation. The dismissive treatment I experienced regarding the ring was part of a larger pattern that had developed over the years since our mother's death, reflecting how our family had come to understand and communicate about my place within our shared relationships. These interactions weren't intentionally cruel, but they consistently reinforced the message that my instincts, interests, and judgments were somehow less reliable than those of family members who had achieved more conventional markers of success. The pattern had become most noticeable during family gatherings, where discussions naturally turned to practical matters like finances, career advancement, or major life decisions. Whenever I contributed observations or suggestions to these conversations, my comments were typically met with the kind of gentle redirection that adults use with children who are trying to participate in discussions beyond their understanding. Family members would listen politely to what I said, then turn to Jessica or Michael for more authoritative perspectives on the same topics. During a Christmas dinner conversation about investment strategies, I had mentioned reading about sustainable investing approaches that were gaining popularity among younger investors who wanted their portfolios to reflect their environmental values. Uncle Thomas had smiled indulgently and suggested that idealistic approaches to investing usually resulted in lower returns than strategies based on proven financial principles. Jessica had added that while social responsibility was admirable, successful investing required focusing primarily on performance metrics rather than allowing emotional considerations to influence decision-making. The message conveyed through these interactions was that my interests in topics like sustainable investing reflected admirable intentions but impractical thinking. Family members appreciated my concern for social and environmental issues, but they also believed that my lack of professional experience in finance made my opinions less valuable than those of people who understood how money actually worked in the real world. Similar patterns emerged when conversations turned to other topics where I might have relevant knowledge or experience. During a discussion about local arts programming, I had shared information about grant opportunities that could help fund community cultural initiatives. Aunt Patricia had responded by suggesting that while arts programs were nice, the community's limited resources were better spent on practical needs like infrastructure improvements and economic development that would benefit everyone, rather than just people interested in cultural activities. When I had mentioned my work with gallery exhibitions that featured local artists, Dorothy Wilson had expressed appreciation for my dedication to supporting creative people, while also noting that most artists struggled financially and that encouraging young people to pursue arts careers was potentially harmful unless they also developed practical skills that could provide stable employment. The underlying message was that my professional involvement in the arts world was sweet but ultimately impractical, both for me personally and for the young people who might be influenced by my example. These conversations weren't hostile or intentionally hurtful, but they consistently positioned my knowledge and experience as less valuable than the practical wisdom offered by family members who had built careers in more traditional fields. My observations about arts funding were dismissed in favor of perspectives about municipal priorities from people who had never actually researched cultural programming. My information about investment trends was overshadowed by conventional financial advice from people who had achieved success through established strategies. The pattern extended to how family members responded to my personal choices and lifestyle decisions. When I had mentioned considering taking a vacation to visit museums in several European cities, Dad had expressed concern about the expense and suggested that I might want to focus on building savings rather than spending money on international travel. Linda had added that while cultural experiences were enriching, practical financial planning should probably take priority for someone in my situation. When I had talked about possibly taking evening classes to learn more about art conservation techniques, Jessica had suggested that I might want to consider whether additional education would actually improve my employment prospects, or whether the time and money might be better invested in developing skills that were more directly marketable. Michael had agreed, noting that many people spent money on educational programs that made them feel like they were improving their situations without actually providing measurable benefits. The cumulative effect of these interactions was to create an environment where my interests, instincts, and judgments were consistently questioned or redirected by family members who believed they were providing helpful guidance. The message communicated through these patterns was that I needed protection from my own impractical tendencies, and that my happiness and security depended on accepting guidance from people who understood practical realities better than I did. When it came to matters involving our mother's belongings and legacy, this pattern became even more pronounced because the decisions carried both emotional and financial significance. Jessica's role as the practical expert, who could distinguish between sentiment and genuine value, had been established early in the process of handling our mother's estate. Her systematic approach to evaluating inherited items was treated as obviously superior to any emotional attachments or intuitive responses that might cloud objective judgment about what things were actually worth. The day we had initially gone through our mother's jewelry box, my interest in the simple silver ring had been met with the kind of tolerant amusement typically reserved for children who became attached to objects that adults recognized as worthless. Jessica had explained patiently that the ring was clearly costume jewelry, but she had also made it clear that my desire to keep it was perfectly understandable, given my sentimental attachment to our mother's memory. Uncle Thomas had added his own perspective as someone who worked with tools and materials daily, confirming that the ring showed obvious signs of being inexpensive jewelry made for everyday wear, rather than a piece with any inherent value. Aunt Patricia had shared stories about other family members who had discovered that inherited jewelry they thought was valuable turned out to be worth very little, emphasizing the importance of maintaining realistic expectations about such things. These conversations had established the framework for how my continued interest in the ring would be interpreted by family members over the following months. When I mentioned researching its possible origins, Jessica had gently suggested that my tendency to find fascinating stories about ordinary objects was charming but potentially misleading if it caused me to develop unrealistic expectations about the ring's significance. When I had shown Dad some of the historical jewelry catalogs I had been studying, he had looked through them politely before suggesting that I might be seeing patterns that weren't actually there, and that my interest in art history might be causing me to imagine connections that were based more on wishful thinking than actual evidence. Linda had agreed, noting that people often convinced themselves they had discovered something valuable when they researched inherited objects intensively enough. The response to my research efforts reflected the same pattern that characterized family reactions to most of my interests and projects. My investigation into the ring's possible significance was seen as another example of my tendency to become absorbed in impractical pursuits that were unlikely to lead to meaningful results. The time and energy I was spending on this research could have been better directed toward more practical activities that would actually improve my situation. Dorothy Wilson had suggested that my fascination with the ring might be a way of avoiding dealing with more pressing concerns about my career development and financial planning. Rather than spending time researching jewelry that was obviously worthless, I might benefit from focusing on professional development activities that could lead to better employment opportunities or higher income. Helen Rodriguez had shared similar concerns, noting that while intellectual curiosity was admirable, it was important not to let research projects become distractions from the practical work of building a stable and secure life. Young people often became fascinated by historical mysteries or artistic pursuits that felt meaningful but didn't contribute to the kind of practical progress that was necessary for long-term security and independence. These responses to my research had taught me to keep my discoveries to myself rather than continuing to share information that family members interpreted as evidence of my impractical thinking. The historical records I had found, the technical analysis I had conducted, and the comparisons I had made with documented examples of period jewelry had all been dismissed as examples of wishful thinking before I had been able to present the actual evidence I had gathered. By the time we gathered for the final division of our mother's belongings, the family's assessment of both the ring and my judgment about its possible significance had been firmly established. I was the family member who had become emotionally attached to a worthless piece of costume jewelry, and who had spent months researching imaginary connections to historical events that existed only in my overly romantic imagination. The folder of research in my purse represented months of careful investigation that had revealed compelling evidence about the ring's actual origins and potential significance. But I knew that presenting this information would be met with the same gentle skepticism that had greeted all of my previous attempts to share what I was learning. My family had already decided that my theories about the ring were examples of the impractical thinking that characterized most of my interests and projects. What they didn't understand was that my research had moved far beyond speculation and wishful thinking to uncover documentation and evidence that would soon be validated by experts who had spent their careers authenticating historical jewelry. The ring they had dismissed so confidently was about to be revealed as something that would challenge every assumption they had made about value, worth, and the reliability of their own judgment about what deserved serious consideration. Part 6. The performance and hidden life living with the knowledge that I possessed what I increasingly believed to be a piece of missing French court jewelry, while maintaining the facade that it was worthless costume jewelry had become an exhausting exercise in self-control and careful performance. Every family gathering required me to remember which version of myself I was supposed to present, suppressing my growing excitement about my research discoveries while playing the role of the sentimental daughter who had formed an emotional attachment to a meaningless trinket. The weight of this deception had grown heavier with each new piece of evidence I uncovered during my research sessions at Whitmore Gallery. Every historical document that supported my theories, every comparison photograph that revealed matching construction techniques, every expert analysis that confirmed the sophisticated craftsmanship of the ring made it more difficult to sit quietly during family discussions about my impractical tendencies and romantic thinking. My daily routine had become a carefully choreographed performance designed to maintain the illusion that my interest in the ring was purely sentimental rather than based on substantial evidence about its potential significance. When I wore the ring to work each morning, I made sure to position it so that the stone faced inward, reducing the chances that colleagues might notice details that could prompt questions about its origins or value. At the gallery, I had developed elaborate strategies for conducting my research without drawing attention to my investigation. I scheduled my visits to the rare books collection and authentication archives during lunch breaks and quiet afternoon periods when other staff members were unlikely to notice my activities. I printed historical documents and photographs at home rather than using the gallery's equipment, avoiding any paper trail that might reveal the scope of my investigation. Dr. Steinberg had begun to notice my increased interest in 19th-century European jewelry authentication techniques, but I had managed to frame my questions as general professional development rather than research related to a specific piece. When she offered to let me attend a workshop on court jewelry identification that was being held at the Metropolitan Heritage Museum in New York, I had been forced to decline because I knew that any formal training in this area might lead to questions about why I was developing expertise in such a specialized field. The irony of my situation was becoming increasingly painful as my research revealed just how extraordinary the ring actually was. The historical records I had discovered suggested that the piece had been created for a member of the French court during one of the most politically tumultuous periods in European history. The craftsmanship techniques used in its construction were associated with the most prestigious workshops of the period, and the stone cutting reflected access to materials and expertise that were available only to individuals with significant wealth and social position. But while I was uncovering evidence that my mother's ring might be worth more than anything my family had ever owned, I was forced to continue accepting their assessment that I was the impractical family member who needed gentle guidance about managing realistic expectations. The contrast between what I was learning and how I was being treated created a constant tension that affected every interaction with family members who continued to view me as someone who required protection from my own poor judgment. My apartment in Riverside District had become a secret research laboratory where I could spread out historical documents, comparison photographs, and technical analyses without worrying about family members discovering the extent of my investigation. I had converted my dining table into a workspace where I could examine the ring under proper lighting and magnification, documenting details that supported my theories about its origins and provenance. The walls of my apartment were covered with printouts of similar rings from museum collections, historical catalogs from European court jewelers, and technical analyses of construction techniques used during the early 19th century. To any visitor, it would have been immediately obvious that I was conducting serious research into historical jewelry authentication, but I had made sure that no family members had reason to visit my apartment during the months when this investigation was taking over my living space. The emotional toll of maintaining this deception had been substantial, particularly during family gatherings where conversations inevitably turned to concerns about my practical decision-making and unrealistic tendencies. Sitting quietly while Jessica explained why my attachment to the ring demonstrated my need for better guidance about distinguishing between sentiment and value required a level of self-control that left me exhausted after every family interaction. During Uncle Thomas's birthday celebration in August, I had been forced to listen to a 20-minute conversation about the importance of teaching young people to make realistic assessments of inherited property. Aunt Patricia had shared stories about neighbors who had wasted money on appraisals for items that turned out to be worthless, while Dorothy Wilson had added her own experiences with friends who had convinced themselves that family heirlooms were more valuable than expert evaluation revealed them to be. Throughout this conversation, I had nodded appropriately and accepted their well-meaning advice while wearing a ring that my research suggested might be worth more than all of their combined annual salaries. The effort required to maintain appropriate facial expressions and responses while suppressing my knowledge about what they were actually discussing had left me feeling drained and isolated from the very people who believed they were helping me develop better judgment. The strain of living this double life had begun to affect other areas of my work and social relationships. Colleagues at the gallery had started to notice that I seemed distracted during staff meetings and less engaged with exhibition planning activities that had previously excited me. Friends had commented that I seemed preoccupied and less available for social activities, though I couldn't explain that my evenings and weekends were increasingly consumed with research that I couldn't discuss with anyone. My relationship with Dr. Steinberg had become particularly complicated as my expertise in court jewelry authentication grew more sophisticated. She had begun asking me to assist with evaluation projects that required knowledge of exactly the historical periods and craftsmanship techniques that I had been studying. But I found myself having to be careful not to demonstrate more expertise than could be explained by casual professional interest. When a private collector had brought in a bracelet that she claimed was from the French court of the 1810s, Dr. Steinberg had asked me to research construction techniques and materials that might help verify its authenticity. My investigation had revealed that the piece was almost certainly a 21st century reproduction, but I had been forced to present my findings in a way that didn't reveal how much I actually knew about the specific workshop techniques and materials used by court jewelers during that period. The authentication workshop that Dr. Steinberg had recommended would have provided exactly the kind of expert training that could help me definitively prove or disprove my theories about the ring's origins. The workshop was being conducted by specialists from the Royal Heritage Foundation, an organization that had spent decades cataloging and recovering missing pieces from European court collections. But attending the workshop would have required explaining my interest in this specialized field, potentially leading to questions that I wasn't prepared to answer. The isolation created by my secret research had been compounded by my growing awareness of how much the ring's potential value could change my family's financial situation. If my theories proved correct, the discovery would not only vindicate my research abilities but would also provide resources that could solve practical problems for family members who had spent years worrying about my financial security and long-term prospects. Dad's ongoing concerns about retirement planning and healthcare costs could be completely eliminated if the ring proved to be as valuable as my research suggested. Jessica's careful financial planning and investment strategies, while admirable, would pale in comparison to the instant wealth that authentic French court jewelry could provide. Uncle Thomas's construction business, which had struggled during recent economic downturns, could be stabilized and expanded with even a fraction of the ring's potential value. But sharing these possibilities with family members would have required convincing them that my research was based on solid evidence rather than wishful thinking, something that seemed impossible given their established opinions about my judgment and practical abilities. The pattern of gentle dismissal that characterized their responses to most of my interests and projects meant that any claims about the ring's potential significance would be met with increased concern about my ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. My mother's death had created a situation where Jessica had naturally assumed responsibility for practical decisions about estate matters and inherited property. This arrangement had worked well for most aspects of settling our mother's affairs, but it had also meant that my own knowledge and instincts about inherited items were automatically considered less reliable than Jessica's systematic approach to evaluation and decision-making. The months of research had revealed that my mother had never known the true significance of the ring she had inherited from her own grandmother. The family stories about its origins had focused on its sentimental value as a piece that had been passed down through generations of women who had little else to leave their daughters. No one had ever suggested that it might be anything more than a modest family heirloom with purely emotional significance. This lack of family knowledge about the ring's potential importance meant that my mother had worn it occasionally without any awareness that she was carrying a piece of missing French court jewelry that historians and art recovery specialists had been attempting to locate for over 2 centuries. The ring had moved through several generations of women who had valued it for its connection to family history rather than its potential monetary worth or historical significance. The possibility that my research was correct created responsibilities that felt overwhelming when I considered them during quiet moments in my apartment surrounded by historical documents and authentication materials. If the ring was authentic, it represented not just personal wealth but also a piece of cultural heritage that belonged in museum collections where it could be studied and appreciated by scholars and the general public. But proving the ring's authenticity would require expert authentication that was beyond my capabilities as a gallery employee with access to basic research resources. The definitive identification of missing court jewelry required specialists who had spent decades studying specific historical periods and who had access to documentation and comparison materials that were not available through general research databases. The authentication process would also inevitably attract attention from family members who would want to understand how I had developed expertise in this specialized field and why I had been conducting research that contradicted their confident assessment of the ring's worthlessness. The revelation of my months of secret investigation would raise questions about why I had hidden my activities and whether my failure to share what I was learning had been motivated by mistrust or deception. As the anniversary of our mother's death approached and Jessica scheduled the final meeting to divide our mother's remaining belongings, I found myself facing the decision of whether to continue maintaining the fiction that I accepted their assessment of the ring's value or to present the evidence I had gathered and request professional authentication that could definitively resolve the question of its significance. The weight of carrying this secret knowledge while participating in family discussions about my need for practical guidance and realistic expectations had become unsustainable. Every conversation about my tendency toward romantic thinking and impractical decision-making felt like a betrayal of the careful research I had conducted and the substantial evidence I had uncovered about the ring's potential importance. But I also understood that presenting my research findings would fundamentally change my relationships with family members who had spent years trying to help me develop better judgment about practical matters. If my theories proved correct, it would reveal that their confident dismissal of the ring's value had been based on assumptions rather than expertise, potentially undermining their trust in their own ability to evaluate situations and make informed decisions. The approaching family meeting represented both an opportunity and a crisis point in my ability to continue living with the growing tension between what I knew and what I was expected to believe about myself and my capabilities. The folder of research materials in my purse had become a symbol of knowledge that could either validate years of careful investigation or confirm my family's assessment that my romantic tendencies led me to see significance where none actually existed. Part 7. Setting the catalyst stage. The October afternoon when we gathered for the final division of our mother's belongings carried the crisp promise of autumn in Connecticut, with golden light filtering through the maple trees that lined Elm Street and the kind of clear, cool air that made everything seem sharper and more immediate. I had spent the morning in my apartment carefully reviewing the research materials I had compiled over the past months, trying to decide whether the time had finally come to share what I had discovered or whether I should continue maintaining the facade that had protected me from family skepticism for so long. The folder containing my documentation lay on the passenger seat of my car as I drove to the family home, its contents representing months of careful investigation that had revealed evidence so compelling that I could no longer ignore the possibility that my theories about the ring's significance were not only accurate but historically important. The historical records, technical analyses, and comparison photographs contained in that folder told a story that contradicted everything my family believed about the worthless costume jewelry I wore daily on my right hand. Dad had spent the morning preparing the house for our gathering, moving furniture to create space for the boxes and containers that held the remaining pieces of our mother's life that needed to be sorted and distributed among family members. Linda had organized the kitchen with coffee, sandwiches, and the kind of practical refreshments that would sustain us through what everyone expected to be an emotionally challenging afternoon of making final decisions about which memories to preserve and which to release. The living room had been arranged to accommodate the 8 adults who would be participating in this process, with chairs positioned around the coffee table where our mother's jewelry box would be placed for final evaluation and distribution. The afternoon light coming through the windows created the kind of warm, intimate atmosphere that made difficult conversations feel slightly easier, though I could sense an underlying tension in the careful way everyone was preparing for discussions that would require balancing practical considerations with emotional attachments. Jessica and Michael had arrived precisely on time, carrying the notebooks and organizational materials that Jessica brought to any gathering that required decision-making or coordination. They had positioned themselves near the coffee table where they could easily access the jewelry box and provide guidance about evaluation procedures and distribution strategies. Jessica's systematic approach to handling these matters had been appreciated by everyone involved, but it had also established her as the authority whose opinions would carry the most weight in any disputes about value or significance. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Patricia had driven over from their house with Ashley, who had been included in this gathering as part of what Patricia described as her education about how families handle difficult transitions and practical decisions about inherited property. Their presence added a layer of community oversight to our family's internal decision-making process, ensuring that our choices would be evaluated by people who understood Millbrook's social expectations about appropriate behavior during estate settlements. Dorothy Wilson had arrived carrying a small notebook where she planned to record decisions about which items would be donated to local charitable organizations and which would be distributed among family members. Her experience helping other families navigate similar situations had made her a valuable resource for understanding the practical aspects of estate division, but it had also meant that she approached these decisions with the kind of systematic efficiency that prioritized practical outcomes over emotional considerations. Helen Rodriguez had brought her knowledge of local antique dealers and charitable organizations that could benefit from donations of household items and personal belongings that family members didn't want to keep. Her practical familiarity with the local marketplace for used goods and collectibles provided important context for understanding which items might have enough value to warrant professional appraisal versus which should simply be donated or discarded. As I walked into this carefully organized gathering wearing the same simple sweater and jeans that had become my uniform for family events, I could feel the familiar dynamic settling into place around me. Jessica was already discussing organizational strategies with Dorothy and Helen, her voice carrying the confident tone she used when managing complex projects that required coordination among multiple people with different priorities and expectations. The others were looking to Jessica for guidance about how to proceed with the evaluation and distribution process, naturally deferring to her expertise in handling complicated situations that involved both emotional and financial considerations. Her systematic approach to these matters had earned the trust and respect of family members who appreciated having someone capable of managing the practical details that needed attention during difficult transitions. I had worn the ring as I did every day, but I had also brought the folder containing my research materials, though I remained uncertain about whether I would have the courage to present information that contradicted the confident assessments that Jessica and others had already made about the ring's obvious worthlessness. The evidence I had gathered was substantial, but sharing it would require challenging the family dynamic that had positioned me as someone who needed guidance rather than someone whose judgment deserved serious consideration. The jewelry box that had been sitting undisturbed in our mother's bedroom for the past year was brought downstairs and placed in the center of the coffee table where everyone could see its contents as Jessica began the systematic evaluation process that would determine which pieces were worth keeping and which should be donated to families who could use everyday jewelry for practical purposes. The atmosphere in the room was one of respectful efficiency, with family members contributing observations and suggestions while deferring to Jessica's expertise in distinguishing between items that had genuine value and those that were worth preserving only for sentimental reasons. The process felt collaborative and democratic, but it was also clear that Jessica's opinions would carry decisive weight in any discussions about value or significance. As Jessica began removing items from the jewelry box and arranging them on the coffee table for evaluation, I found myself studying the faces of family members who were prepared to make final decisions about our mother's belongings based on careful analysis and practical considerations. These were good people who wanted to handle this responsibility thoughtfully and appropriately, but they were also people who had already decided that my tendency toward romantic thinking made me an unreliable source of information about practical matters. The folder in my purse felt heavier with each passing minute as I watched Jessica systematically evaluate pieces of jewelry that our mother had accumulated over decades of modest purchases and occasional gifts. Her analysis of each item was thorough and logical, taking into account both the materials and craftsmanship that determined market value and the sentimental significance that might justify keeping pieces that weren't worth much money. When Jessica reached for the simple silver ring that had been the focus of my secret research for the past months, I felt my heart rate increase as I prepared for the moment when she would hold up the piece that my family considered obviously worthless costume jewelry, while I sat quietly knowing that it might be one of the most historically significant items any of us had ever encountered. The conversation that followed would either validate months of careful investigation or confirm my family's assessment that my romantic tendencies led me to imagine significance where none actually existed. The evidence in my folder was compelling enough to warrant professional evaluation, but presenting it would require challenging family dynamics that had been established over years of interactions where my judgment had been consistently considered less reliable than Jessica's practical expertise. The weight of carrying this secret knowledge while participating in family discussions about my need for realistic expectations had become increasingly difficult to bear, particularly when those discussions focused specifically on the ring that represented the most important discovery I had ever made. Every gentle correction about the importance of distinguishing between sentiment and value felt like a challenge to evidence that I had spent months carefully documenting and verifying. But I also understood that sharing my research findings would fundamentally alter my relationships with family members who had spent years trying to help me develop better judgment about practical matters. If my theories proved correct, it would reveal that their confident dismissal of my instincts had been based on assumptions rather than expertise, potentially damaging their trust in their own ability to evaluate situations and make informed decisions. The afternoon light streaming through the windows created an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy that made the approaching conversation feel both more difficult and more necessary. These were the people who cared about me most in the world, who had supported me through the grief of losing our mother, and who genuinely wanted to help me build a secure and happy life. But they were also people who had never considered the possibility that my interests and instincts might lead to discoveries that challenged their understanding of value and significance. As Jessica lifted the ring from the jewelry box and prepared to deliver her final assessment of its obvious worthlessness, I found myself faced with the decision that had been building for months. I could continue accepting their evaluation and maintain the family dynamic that positioned me as someone who needed guidance and protection from my own impractical tendencies, or I could present the evidence I had gathered and request the professional authentication that could definitively resolve questions about the ring's true significance. The moment felt suspended in the golden afternoon light, with the familiar voices of family members discussing practical considerations and appropriate expectations while I sat quietly holding knowledge that could transform not just our understanding of my mother's ring, but our entire family's financial future and our assumptions about who possessed reliable judgment about matters of genuine importance. Part 8. Escalating Tension and Dynamics. Jessica's systematic evaluation of our mother's jewelry collection had proceeded with the kind of methodical efficiency that characterized all of her approaches to complex decision-making. But when she reached the simple silver ring that had become the focus of my secret investigation, her tone shifted to accommodate what she clearly viewed as a more delicate family situation requiring both practical guidance and emotional sensitivity. She held the ring up to the afternoon light streaming through the living room windows, turning it slowly so that everyone could observe the modest piece that had somehow captured my sentimental attachment over the past year. Her examination was thorough and professional, noting the obvious signs of age and wear that she interpreted as evidence of the ring's long history as an inexpensive piece of everyday jewelry that had been passed down through generations of women who had little else of value to leave their daughters. The cloudy stone that caught the light in unusual ways was dismissed with the kind of gentle certainty that Jessica brought to all of her professional evaluations, her voice carrying the patient tone she used when explaining complex financial concepts to clients who lacked the expertise to understand investment strategies or market analysis. She pointed out the obvious signs that identified the stone as synthetic material designed to imitate more valuable gems, noting that the lack of brilliance and the cloudy appearance were characteristic of glass or crystal substitutes that were commonly used in costume jewelry manufactured during the mid-20th century. Michael had been observing this evaluation with the careful attention he brought to any situation where his legal expertise might be relevant, and he added his own professional perspective about the importance of maintaining realistic expectations when dealing with inherited items that might have significant sentimental value but little monetary worth. His experience with estate planning had taught him that family members often developed emotional attachments to inherited objects that led them to overestimate their practical significance, creating disappointment and sometimes conflict when professional appraisals revealed the actual market value of pieces that had seemed more important than they actually were. The conversation that developed around Jessica's evaluation of the ring reflected the same collaborative but hierarchical dynamic that characterized most family discussions about practical matters, with various family members contributing observations and experiences while deferring to Jessica's expertise in making final determinations about value and significance. Uncle Thomas shared his perspective as someone who worked with tools and materials daily, confirming that the ring's construction showed obvious signs of mass production techniques, rather than the careful craftsmanship that would be expected in genuinely valuable jewelry. Aunt Patricia contributed her own experiences with inherited jewelry that had turned out to be worth less than family stories had suggested, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between items that had genuine historical or monetary significance, and those that were valuable only because of the emotional connections they represented. Her stories about neighbors and friends who had discovered that family heirlooms were worth much less than they had expected served as cautionary tales about the dangers of allowing sentiment to override practical evaluation of inherited property. Dorothy Wilson added her knowledge of local antique dealers and estate sales specialists who regularly encountered families dealing with similar situations, sharing observations about the kinds of inherited jewelry that actually commanded significant prices versus the much larger category of items that were worth keeping only for their sentimental value. Her experience helping friends navigate estate settlements had taught her to recognize the difference between pieces that warranted professional appraisal and those that could be evaluated accurately through careful visual inspection. Ashley, who had been listening quietly to this adult conversation about practical decision-making and realistic expectations, offered her own perspective as someone from a younger generation who had grown up understanding the importance of distinguishing between emotional attachments and actual value when making decisions about inherited property. Her comments reflected the kind of practical wisdom that her parents had worked to instill in her about avoiding the romantic thinking that could lead to poor financial decisions or unrealistic expectations about inherited objects. Throughout this discussion, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of how thoroughly the family had established the narrative framework that positioned my attachment to the ring as an example of the impractical thinking that characterized my approach to most important decisions. The gentle but consistent message being communicated through their observations and advice was that my sentimental connection to the ring was understandable and appropriate, but that it would be harmful for me to develop unrealistic expectations about its significance beyond its personal meaning to me. Jessica's analysis of the ring's obvious characteristics was delivered with the same systematic approach she brought to evaluating investment opportunities for her clients, noting details about construction techniques, materials, and wear patterns that supported her confident assessment of its value. Her explanation was thorough and educational, designed to help me understand the specific factors that professional appraisers would consider when evaluating similar pieces, and why those factors clearly indicated that the ring was worth keeping only for sentimental reasons. The certainty with which Jessica expressed her conclusions about the ring's worthlessness reflected not arrogance but rather confidence in her ability to distinguish between items that deserved serious consideration and those that were obviously what they appeared to be. Her professional experience evaluating financial instruments and investment opportunities had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and emotional associations to identify the practical realities that determined actual value. And she applied this same analytical approach to evaluating inherited property. Michael's legal perspective added additional authority to Jessica's assessment, particularly his observations about the importance of getting professional appraisals for any inherited items that might have significant value while avoiding the expense of formal evaluations for pieces that could be accurately assessed through careful visual inspection. His experience with estate planning had taught him to recognize which inherited items were likely to surprise families with their value and which were exactly what they appeared to be. The conversation had developed into what felt like an intervention designed to help me understand the difference between appropriate sentimental attachment and the kind of unrealistic thinking that could lead to disappointment or poor decision-making. Family members were sharing their observations and advice with genuine care and concern, but they were also making it clear that my interest in researching the ring's possible significance was viewed as another example of my tendency to avoid facing practical realities about my situation. Uncle Thomas's comments about the ring's obvious construction characteristics were delivered with the kind of patient explanation he might use when teaching a young person about the difference between quality materials and mass-produced substitutes. His decades of experience working with tools and building materials had given him confidence in his ability to evaluate craftsmanship and construction techniques, and he applied this expertise to confirming that the ring showed none of the characteristics that would be expected in genuinely valuable jewelry. Aunt Patricia's stories about other families' experiences with inherited jewelry served to reinforce the message that my situation was neither unique nor particularly surprising, but rather a common example of how people often convinced themselves that family heirlooms were more significant than expert evaluation revealed them to be. Her emphasis on the importance of maintaining realistic expectations was meant to protect me from the kind of disappointment that occurred when romantic thinking was allowed to override practical analysis. Dorothy Wilson's knowledge of the local marketplace for used jewelry and collectibles provided additional context for understanding why Jessica's assessment was almost certainly accurate. Noting that estate sales specialists and antique dealers regularly encountered similar pieces that families had hoped would turn out to be valuable discoveries, Her experience had taught her to recognize the difference between genuine finds and the much more common situation where sentimental attachment led people to overestimate the significance of inherited objects. The weight of this collective wisdom and practical experience felt overwhelming as I sat listening to explanations that positioned my months of careful research as examples of the romantic thinking that needed to be corrected through exposure to realistic analysis and professional expertise. The folder containing my documentation remained unopened in my purse, its contents representing evidence that contradicted every confident assertion being made about the ring's obvious worthlessness. But presenting my research findings would require challenging not just Jessica's specific assessment of the ring, but the entire family dynamic that had positioned her as the practical expert whose judgment could be trusted to override my tendency toward impractical thinking and unrealistic expectations. The systematic way that family members were reinforcing her conclusions suggested that any disagreement with her evaluation would be interpreted as further evidence of my need for guidance about distinguishing between sentiment and reality. Helen Rodriguez added her own perspective about the importance of accepting expert guidance when dealing with inherited property, sharing observations about neighbors who had wasted money on professional appraisals for items that careful visual inspection could have identified as obviously worthless. Her comments reinforced the message that Jessica's evaluation was thorough enough to eliminate any need for additional professional consultation and that pursuing further authentication would represent exactly the kind of impractical decision-making that my family was trying to help me avoid. As the conversation continued with various family members contributing additional observations and advice about the importance of realistic expectations and practical decision-making, I found myself facing the realization that presenting my research would not only challenge Jessica's specific conclusions about the ring, but would also reveal that I had been conducting months of secret investigation that contradicted their confident assessment of my judgment and capabilities. The moment felt suspended between the accumulated weight of family expectations about my tendency toward romantic thinking and the compelling evidence I had gathered about the ring's potential significance, creating a tension that would soon be resolved in a way that none of us could have anticipated. Part 9. The Helper Attempts. The conversation about my attachment to the ring had evolved into what felt like a family intervention, with various members taking turns to offer practical advice and guidance designed to help me develop more realistic expectations about inherited items and their actual value versus their sentimental significance. The tone throughout these exchanges remained consistently caring and supportive, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested this was an important teaching moment that required my careful attention and acceptance. Jessica had moved beyond her initial evaluation of the ring's obvious worthlessness to address what she clearly viewed as the broader pattern of impractical thinking that my research into its possible significance represented. Her voice carried the patient authority she used when helping clients understand why their emotional attachments to particular investments were interfering with sound financial decision-making. And she applied this same approach to explaining why my months of investigation into the ring's origins reflected the kind of wishful thinking that could become harmful if allowed to continue unchecked. She had prepared what amounted to a comprehensive presentation about the importance of accepting expert guidance when dealing with inherited property, drawing on her professional experience with estate planning and asset evaluation to explain the specific factors that determined whether inherited items warranted professional appraisal or could be accurately assessed through careful visual inspection. Her analysis was thorough and educational, designed to help me understand the practical principles that should guide decisions about inherited objects and why those principles clearly indicated that further research into the ring's significance would be a waste of time and energy. Michael had supported Jessica's assessment by sharing his legal perspective on the kinds of inherited items that typically surprised families with their value versus the much larger category of objects that were exactly what they appeared to be despite family stories or sentimental attachments that might suggest otherwise. His experience with estate planning had taught him to recognize the warning signs that indicated when family members were developing unrealistic expectations about inherited property, and he suggested that my research activities showed several characteristics that typically led to disappointment when professional evaluation revealed the actual facts. The legal framework that Michael described for handling inherited property emphasized the importance of distinguishing between items that had genuine historical documentation or provenance, and those that were valuable only because of family stories or emotional associations that couldn't be verified through objective analysis. He explained that professional appraisers and authentication experts had specific criteria for evaluating inherited jewelry, and that pieces like my mother's ring almost never met those criteria despite the hopes and expectations of family members who had formed emotional attachments to them. Uncle Thomas had offered his perspective as someone who had spent decades working with materials and tools, emphasizing his ability to recognize quality craftsmanship and construction techniques that would be expected in genuinely valuable jewelry. His evaluation of the ring had confirmed Jessica's assessment about its obvious characteristics as mass-produced costume jewelry, and he suggested that my research into its possible significance reflected a misunderstanding of the factors that determined whether inherited items warranted serious investigation. His comments were delivered with the kind of gentle instruction he might use when teaching a young person about the difference between quality materials and inexpensive substitutes, emphasizing that experience with tools and construction had taught him to recognize the telltale signs that identified the ring as exactly what it appeared to be rather than something with hidden significance. His perspective added the weight of practical hands-on expertise to Jessica's more theoretical analysis of why further research would be unlikely to reveal anything that contradicted their visual assessment. Aunt Patricia had expanded the conversation to address what she described as my pattern of becoming absorbed in projects that felt intellectually interesting but didn't contribute to the kind of practical progress that was necessary for building long-term security and stability. Her observations about my research activities were framed as expressions of concern about how I was investing my time and energy, suggesting that the months I had spent investigating the ring's possible significance could have been better directed toward professional development or career advancement activities that would actually improve my situation. Her advice was delivered with the kind of loving firmness that characterized her approach to guiding young family members away from decisions that might feel satisfying in the moment but were unlikely to lead to meaningful benefits. She emphasized that intellectual curiosity was admirable when directed toward practical goals, but that research projects focused on inherited objects rarely produced the kind of results that justified the time and effort they required, particularly when visual inspection had already provided clear information about an item's actual characteristics. Dorothy Wilson had contributed her extensive experience helping elderly friends and neighbors handle estate settlements, sharing specific examples of situations where family members had convinced themselves that inherited items were more significant than professional evaluation revealed them to be. Her stories were meant to illustrate the common pattern of people developing emotional attachments to inherited objects that led them to see significance where none actually existed, and to emphasize the importance of accepting realistic assessments rather than pursuing research that was unlikely to change the fundamental facts about an item's value. The advice that Dorothy offered was based on decades of practical experience with estate situations, and she presented it with the authority of someone who had witnessed the consequences of both realistic and unrealistic approaches to handling inherited property. Her emphasis on the importance of accepting expert guidance rather than pursuing independent research reflected her understanding of how often family members created unnecessary difficulties for themselves by refusing to accept professional assessments that contradicted their hopes or expectations. Helen Rodriguez had added her knowledge of the local marketplace for used jewelry and collectibles, explaining that estate sales specialists and antique dealers regularly encountered families who had spent time and money researching inherited items that turned out to be worth exactly what visual inspection had suggested. Her observations about the difference between genuine discoveries and wishful thinking were meant to help me understand why professional experts could assess pieces like my mother's ring accurately without the kind of extensive research that I had been conducting. Her perspective emphasized the practical reality that truly valuable inherited jewelry almost always showed obvious signs of quality materials and sophisticated craftsmanship that were immediately apparent to experienced evaluators, and that pieces requiring extensive research to prove their significance were almost invariably worth much less than the time and effort invested in investigating them. This practical wisdom was offered as guidance that could help me avoid the disappointment that typically resulted from pursuing authentication that contradicted initial expert assessment. Ashley had offered her perspective as someone from a younger generation who had grown up understanding the importance of focusing time and energy on activities that produced measurable results rather than pursuing projects that felt intellectually interesting but were unlikely to lead to practical benefits. Her comments reflected the values that her parents had worked to instill in her about making strategic decisions regarding how to invest personal resources for maximum long-term advantage. The advice that Ashley shared was framed as concern about my professional development and career advancement, suggesting that the research skills I had been applying to investigating the ring's significance could be more beneficially directed toward activities that would actually improve my employment prospects or financial situation. Her observations were meant to help me understand how my research project appeared to younger family members who were focused on building practical success through strategic decision-making. Dad had been listening to this collaborative effort to provide guidance and advice with the careful attention he brought to any conversation where family members were sharing expertise about practical matters that affected someone's long-term well-being. His comments focused on his concern about my tendency to become absorbed in projects that felt meaningful to me, but didn't contribute to the kind of practical progress that was necessary for building security and independence. His perspective reflected the worry of a parent who wanted to see his daughter making decisions that would lead to stability and success, and he suggested that my research into the ring's possible significance might be a way of avoiding the more challenging work of focusing on career development and financial planning that required immediate attention. His advice was delivered with the loving concern of someone who had watched me struggle with practical decisions and wanted to help me understand how to prioritize activities that would actually improve my situation. Linda had approached the conversation from her perspective as someone who had experience helping people navigate difficult transitions and emotional challenges, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between activities that provided genuine healing and growth versus those that might feel comforting but actually prevented progress toward acceptance and practical action. Her observations about my research project were framed as concern about whether investigating the ring's significance was helping me process grief about our mother's death or was actually preventing me from moving forward. Her advice reflected her professional experience with patients who sometimes developed attachments to objects or activities that provided emotional comfort but interfered with the practical work of rebuilding their lives after significant losses. She suggested that my research might be serving a psychological function that was understandable but ultimately unhelpful if it was preventing me from focusing on the career and financial planning that required immediate attention. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.